She was sold for $1. That's what the slip of paper said. The one Elias Boone folded into fourths and tucked into the pocket of his old canvas coat. A crude contract scrawled in whiskey-shaky handwriting and witnessed by two men half-blind with drink. She was sold for $1. And he never touched her once. But let's go back to where it all started. The wind off the Montana ridge carried a bite even in spring, cold enough to make the pine needles chatter. Snow still clung to the shaded creases of the mountain. Down in the basin, where the town of Bitter Ridge leaned against the river like a drunk with nowhere left to fall, the folks didn't much care for strangers. And Elias Boone, well, folks didn't much care for him either. He hadn't always been a mountain man. Once, he'd run horses for the Union. Once, he'd had a wife named Delia and a daughter who laughed like wind chimes. But that was before the fever came down out of the hills and left two graves behind his cabin, marked only by river stones and one cedar cross that never stood straight. He stopped talking much after that. He hunted. He traded pelts twice a year. He drank from streams and didn't look other people in the eye unless they were dying or bleeding. When he did ride into town, folks gave him a wide berth. Not because he was mean, he wasn't, but because there was something about a man who'd buried everything he ever loved with his own two hands. And yet it was Elias Boone who stepped forward when the girl was led up on that creaking auction block outside the livery. She wasn't much older than 16. Her wrists were bound. A sack covered her head, but the fabric clung where her breath pushed against it, showing the slope of her nose, the tremble of her chin. Her dress was torn. Someone had tried to clean her up, but the mud was ground too deep into the seams. She didn't cry, just stood still like a post in the wind. A few men chuckled from the crowd. One spat. A voice from the back muttered something about waste of feed. Most just watched. "Run away," said the auctioneer, who looked more like a butcher than a trader. "Property of the Miller Ranch. Caught trying to flee with horses and goods. Sheriff signed the release. Miller don't want her back. Damaged stock, he says. $1, boys. Just $1 to take her off this county's hands." The crowd stayed quiet. Then Elias stepped forward. He didn't say a word. Just pulled a silver dollar from his coat. Tarnished, dull, worn smooth. At the edges. He placed it in the butcher's palm like he was paying for a bullet he didn't want to fire. The crowd shifted. Someone laughed nervously. Someone else said, "You sure, Boone?" Elias nodded once. The sack stayed on as the girl was led to his mule cart. She climbed up without a sound, arms still bound, and sat hunched against the cold. Elias said nothing. He turned the mule toward the pass road that led north into the tree-shadowed ridges where his cabin sat, like a secret nobody wanted to share. They didn't speak for 3 days. He cut the rope off her wrists the first night, but didn't take the sack from her head. He left a basin of water by the fire and turned his back as she washed. He gave her the cot where his daughter used to sleep and didn't once cross the invisible line between her and him. When he cooked, he gave her food first. When she slept, he sat outside and smoked, letting the coyotes talk to the dark. By the third day, the sack was gone. He came in from the morning trap line, carrying 2 snowshoe hares by the feet, and found her standing by the hearth, hair wet, hands trembling, slightly around a cup of water. Her face was thinner than it should have been for a girl her age. Freckles across the bridge of her nose, one of them shaped like a teardrop. Her eyes, pale green, and in them, hunger, not for food but for something deeper, safety. Place. Name. You got a name? Elias asked. She shook her head. Or maybe she did and just didn't want to share it. "I'll call you Mercy then," he said quietly. "If that's all right." She didn't answer. That night, she left a strip of rabbit hide by his plate before supper. She'd cleaned it, stretched it, salted it. The gesture was small, but Elias understood. The days passed slow. Spring pressed its fingers into the valley. The snow melted off the pines. Birds came back. Mercy started sweeping the cabin without being asked. She boiled water. She learned where the fishing line was kept. She didn't talk much, but neither did Elias. Sometimes he'd catch her staring at the cedar cross outside, the one that leaned eastward like it couldn't bear the sky. "You buried someone?" she asked one afternoon, voice rough like she hadn't used it in months. He nodded. "My daughter." She turned away, pressing her palm flat against the window. That night, she left 2 trout by the fire. He didn't ask where she'd caught them, but rumors don't stay quiet in towns like Bitter Ridge, and the men who'd laughed at the auction began to wonder why Elias Boone took in a girl and never once sent her back. That be why week's end, a rider was seen heading up the trail toward Boone's cabin. That he didn't carry a letter or supplies, that he carried a shotgun and a grin that said trouble was coming. Elias felt it before he saw it. The way the birds went quiet. The way Mercy stood stiff by the window, holding her breath like she could stop the world if she just stayed still long enough. Stay inside, he said, quietly. Outside, the wind shifted, and down the trail came the man who thought a dollar bought more than it ever should have. Elias stood on the porch, his rifle resting loose in the crook of his elbow, more out of habit than threat. The man on the horse didn't bother dismounting. He rode close, stopping, just short of the first porch step, dust clinging to his boots and the hem of his coat. The sun was behind him, casting his face in shadow, but the smirk was plain. Name's Carson McCleary, he said, letting the reins fall slack. Miller Ranch sent me up. Thought I'd check in on their missing property. Elias didn't blink. She's not missing. I paid for her. Carson grinned wider. Sure, $1 whole. That don't buy more than a pack of nails these days. But Miller figures maybe she forgot something. Like her duty. Thought I might help her remember. Inside, through the slatted window, Mercy had vanished from view. Elias said nothing. He didn't raise his voice or lift his rifle. He just stood there, steady as the mountains behind him. She ain't yours, Carson went on. You didn't even change the papers. She's still branded to the Miller stock. I didn't buy her to own her, Elias said, then why'd you do it? Carson leaned forward in the saddle. You one of those saints? Taking in broken girls so you can feel big. Elias's eyes narrowed, but his voice stayed even. I saw a child shaking in a sack. That was enough. Carson chuckled and spat in the dirt. Miller don't like loose ends. Neither do I. He tapped the butt of the shotgun slung across his saddle. You gonna stop me if I go in and get her? Elias glanced at the door. You're welcome to try. For a moment, the two men stood locked in silence. Carson still smiling like a man trying to sell a lie. Elias calm as the snow peaks in the distance. Eventually, Carson huffed and yanked his reins. I'll be back, he muttered. And I won't be alone. The mule's hooves kicked dust as he rode off down the trail. That night, Elias sat on the porch, cleaning his rifle with quiet, methodical care. Mercy came out, barefoot, arms crossed in front of her thin frame. Why didn't you let him take me? She asked. Elias paused. The firelight from inside flickered across her cheek, showing a bruise that hadn't quite faded. Because you're not theirs, he said. And you're not mine either. But you deserve to be somewhere no one looks at you like meat. She didn't answer, just sat beside him, knees tucked to her chest. From that night on, Mercy followed Elias everywhere. She carried the traps. She learned to gut a fish without gagging. She stopped flinching when his hand brushed close. There was no talk of leaving and no promises made. Just a rhythm between them, quiet, honest, and fragile as a robin's egg. But Bitter Ridge had its own rhythm. And news moved like water finding cracks. A.T. the saloon, men muttered. At the general store, a widow whispered. He took that girl up the mountain like she was a prize pig. Even the preacher's wife clucked her tongue and said, The Lord sees what's done in cabins. Then came the riders, .3 of them. Not sheriff's men, hired hands. Rough and red-eyed. They arrived just past sunrise, stirring dust as they approached the gate to Elias's land. This time, they didn't wait for invitation. Mercy saw them. First, through the trees where she was cutting kindling. Her breath hitched. She dropped the axe and ran. Elias met her halfway down the hill. They're here, she whispered. He nodded. Go inside. But this time, she didn't point. One of the riders, tall, red beard, scar above his lip, called out. Boone, you got something that don't belong to you. Elias stepped out with his rifle in hand, but pointed down. She belongs to herself, he said. She's property, the man growled. Signed and sealed. Miller wants her back. We got paper from the judge. I have paper too, Elias replied, pulling the folded bill of sale from his coat. The rider sneered. That ain't legal. That's a whiskey deal made under a lean-to. That's all most of this town's justice is, Elias said. The second rider, younger and twitchy, shifted in his saddle. We're talking her, Boone. One way or another. Behind Elias, Mercy stepped out onto the porch. She didn't run this time. She didn't hide. She stood barefoot, arms folded, chin raised just enough to show she wasn't a child anymore. I'm not going back, she said. The red-bearded rider laughed. Don't matter what you say, girl. Law's the law. Elias's voice turned quiet. That girl hasn't raised her voice once in weeks. She hasn't taken more than she's given. You take her now, you'll be dragging her back into something worse than prison. And you'll be breaking more than a man's fence. The riders looked at one another. Then the red-bearded one spat. We'll give you 2 days. Sheriff will be up here next time. With paper and rope. They turned and rode off. Dust swirled behind them like a warning. Mercy didn't move. Her hands trembled, but she didn't look away. What are we going to do? She asked, voice hoarse. Elias didn't answer right away. He looked out over the trees, the mountain ridges, the long slope of wild country that had raised him from ruin. Depends. He finally said, on whether a man's worth is measured by what he owns or what he's willing to protect. That night, he buried the paper deep beneath the hearthstone, not to hide it, but because it didn't matter anymore. The hoofbeats came just after midnight, slow, measured, not hurried, not loud, just enough to press against the stillness of the trees like a hand against glass. Elias sat up on his cot before the second step echoed. Mercy was already awake, standing barefoot near the door in her nightdress, eyes wide. They're early, she whispered. He nodded. He hadn't slept anyway. Out the window, the trees moved like ghosts. For horses, 2 lanterns. One man carried a badge, the others didn't. They stopped just beyond the gate, just outside the lantern light. Long enough for Elias to recognize the tallest, Sheriff Clayton Pruitt. A man who followed the letter of the law even when it bled. Elias stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand, but barrel pointed to the floorboards. Evening, Boone. Pruitt said, voice low. Midnight's a strange hour for a visit. Didn't want a scene. Lot of noise in town lately. Folks whispering about you keeping a girl who don't belong to you. Elias said nothing. His eyes drifted past the sheriff to the man riding beside him. Carson McCleary, again. But now he had a black eye and a different kind of grin. One that said revenge tasted better with paper backing it. She's not property, Elias said softly. That's not what the law says, Pruitt replied. Miller filed charges. Claimed theft of property. Even showed the girl's brand. MR. Burned into her shoulder. Elias's jaw tensed. She's a human being, not a mule. Pruitt dismounted. He wasn't a cruel man. But he was tired, and law in these parts didn't often bend toward kindness. Listen, I don't want blood. Tonight. But if you don't turn her over, there will be blood. Miller's men are already halfway up the ridge. They're not going to wait for morning. Inside, Mercy pressed her back against the wall, breath shallow. She'd heard the brand part. Her hand moved to her left shoulder. She touched it through the dress like she could rub it away. Elias turned slightly toward the open door. You hear all that? He called. There was a pause, then soft footsteps. And Mercy appeared in the doorway, face pale, jaw clenched. If I go, she said, looking at Pruitt. Do they let you sleep better at night? Pruitt didn't answer. Mercy stepped forward. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't shake. I was bought at 12. Not even old enough to bleed yet. Cooked meals. Cleaned floors. And when the man's wife died, he started coming to my bed at night. When I cried, he whipped me. When I ran, he branded me. That's your property, Sheriff. That's what this paper trail protects. Pruitt looked away. Even Carson's grin faltered. Elias stepped off the porch, slow and calm. No one's taking her, he said. Carson stiffened. You don't get to say, I paid your man $1. Elias cut in. But I've paid every day since with silence and sweat, and keeping her safe when none of you would. The sheriff sighed. Boone, don't make me choose between the law and a good man. Elias glanced at the tree leaned at a flicker of movement. He already knew what it was, not Miller's men. Not tonight, but someone had followed Carson last time. And someone had been watching ever since. Out of the trees stepped 2 figures. Silent, tall, lean, Blackfoot, not in war paint. Just leather and patience. The taller one carried a bow, unstrung. The other had no weapon, only a leather pouch. They came forward like ghosts, and stopped beside Elias. Pruitt's hand hovered near his belt. Boone, what is this? Elias didn't move. She's not one of us, the tall Blackfoot man said. But she came to our camp 2 days ago. Left trout on the stones. Said nothing. Just watched the children. Didn't ask for food. Didn't ask for help. just looked at the fire like she was trying to remember something that never belonged to her. The second man spoke next. His voice was younger. She didn't cry when she saw the women, but her eyes, they did. Carson bristled. This don't concern them. Don't it? Elias said softly. You take her now, it won't just be your law you offend. The taller Blackfoot man stepped forward, close enough for the firelight to catch the lines on his face. He looked at Pruitt. In your law, a girl sold at 12 can be punished for trying to be free. In ours, we ask why a man would buy a child in the first place. Pruitt looked down. The lantern crackled in the stillness. I can't stop them, Elias said. But if they take her, I won't be the only one bleeding. Mercy walked to Elias's side. Her bare feet touched the dirt. She stood between the law and the trees. Her shoulder throbbed under the fabric, but her spine stayed straight. Pruitt looked at her like a man staring at a storm. He turned to Carson. You said she ran away. Carson nodded. You said Miller didn't want her back. He hesitated. Said he didn't want her after she broke his nose. Pruitt nodded once, then turned back to his men. No one's going up that ridge tonight. He said, but she was sold for $1, Pruitt said. That means she's not worth a war. He mounted his horse and turned without another word. Carson stared for a moment longer, then spat and followed. Elias stood silent as the horses rode off. The Blackfoot men nodded once to Mercy, then vanished into the trees like they'd never been there. And in the stillness that followed, Mercy did something Elias hadn't seen her do before. She sat down in the dirt and began to cry. The crying didn't last long, not because the pain was gone, but because there was only so much grief a person could let out at once. Mercy wiped her face on the hem of her dress, stood up, and walked back into the cabin without a word. Elias didn't follow right away. He stood in the dark, listening to the wind stir the pines, watching the place where the Blackfoot men had disappeared. The fire inside was low by the time he stepped in. She was seated at the table now, her back to the door, a cup of cold coffee untouched in front of her. Her shoulders were square, but her hands trembled where they rested on the tabletop. He didn't ask her if she was all right. She wouldn't have said yes, and he wouldn't have believed her if she had. Instead, he crossed to the old chest near the hearth and opened the lid. Inside were 3 things: a folded union coat, a tin box, and a small framed tintype photograph. He picked up the photograph and set it gently in front of her. A woman with kind eyes. A child, maybe 5, with pigtails and a crooked grin. Elias's family. What little the world had given and taken. She died in the second spring after we moved here, he said. Fever came fast. Took him both in 3 days. Mercy looked at the photograph for a long time. She didn't touch it. Just let her eyes fall into the faces like they were windows she wasn't sure she had permission to open. I used to think I should have died first, Elias continued. That maybe God got it backward. Left me behind just to prove a point. He sat across from her. You were never meant to end up on that block, Mercy. Her voice was soft. Then where was I meant to end up? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into the tin box and pulled out an old Navajo pendant. Turquoise, cracked, but still bright. He set it on the table. My wife's mother gave her that. Said it came from a trader who married into the dine. Said it meant protection. When the fever took her, I buried it with her hand. He looked up, his eyes tired but steady. When I buried my daughter, I dug it up again. Mercy's eyes moved to the pendant. You think it still works? She asked. I think it does what it can, he said. They sat in silence for a long time after that. In the morning, Mercy was up before the sun. She had cleaned the floors, boiled water, and even gathered fresh eggs from the hen coop Elias didn't remember building with anyone else. She moved through the cabin like she had always been there. He stepped outside, watching the sky bleed orange across the eastern ridgeline. Behind him, her voice came soft. I want to learn to shoot. He turned. Why? She held his gaze. Because they might come back, and I don't want to be afraid when they do. Elias nodded once. That afternoon, they rode out to the south slope, where the trees thinned and the land gave space to breath and sound. He set up 3 rusted cans on a fence rail and handed her the Winchester. She was light with it, nervous, but her eyes were focused. Not about the shoulder, he said. It's about your breath. Find the still moment between the in and out. She missed the first 4 shots. Got the 5th. When the can clattered to the dirt, She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Elias smiled, just barely. For the first time since she'd come, she smiled back. In town, the gossip quieted. Sheriff Pruitt didn't mention the night he turned back. Miller grumbled, but he didn't send more men. Mercy's story had started to float in from other mouths. Women at the well, travelers at the post. Whispers about what kind of place the Miller Ranch really was. And then one day, a wagon came down from the Blackfoot encampment point. 2 women. For children. One old man with cloudy eyes. They brought dried meat, beads, and firewood. They asked for nothing. Just sat quietly outside the cabin, watching Mercy gather herbs and Elias sharpen tools. One of the children, barefoot, no older than 8, handed Mercy a carved wooden rabbit, then ran off into the trees. They said they don't pity you. Elias translated quietly. They say you have walked through fire. And now you smell like smoke, not ash. Mercy blinked. That night, they cooked together. Black beans, rabbit, wild onion. Elias pulled a second chair out from storage and fixed the leg. Mercy put a flower in a jar and set it at the center of the table. And when the fire burned low, she touched her shoulder. The brand was still there. MR, ugly and raised. Will it ever go away? She asked. Elias didn't lie. No, she nodded slowly. Then I'll cover it. With what? He didn't ask. He already knew that she'd cover it with days like this. With clean mornings and firewood and slow, steady peace. And maybe one day, when someone asked her about that brand, she'd say, that was the last mark someone else made on me. After that, I chose the rest. Years later, they called her Miss Mercy Boone. Not the girl who was bought. Not the one from Miller Ranch. Just Miss Boone. A woman who lived on the ridge where the river turned silver at dusk, who grew wild herbs the doctors came looking for, who could shoot straighter than most men and spoke Blackfoot better than some born to it. The brand never faded. But the story around it did. It changed, quietly, like moss climbing a stone, into something no one could twist anymore. Not pity, not shame, just history. A thing that happened. A scar earned. A warning carried. The last time Elias saw Sheriff Pruitt, the old lawman was leaning against the rail outside the general store, his hands gnarled from decades of holding more weight than one man should. He nodded at Mercy as she passed by, a respectful nod, not a greeting. Not anymore. She wasn't someone folks whispered about. She was someone they left firewood for when winter came early. Someone the young girls asked to braid their hair and teach them how to make salves from bare root and birch bark. She grew into her name. The sheriff said that day. Elias just nodded. She grew beyond it. Back at the cabin, he'd built a small greenhouse with her, glass panels, wood frame, warm all year. She kept herbs there. Medicinals. Dried rows of lavender and sage and wild mint strung from the rafters. He caught her humming some days, soft, almost to herself, like she didn't realize sound could carry joy now. But one morning, the mule didn't come back. They found her 2 miles out, laid down in the grass, breathing heavy. Mercy knelt beside her, whispered something Elias didn't hear, then stayed until the breath stopped. She was quieter after that. Not sad, just distant. Like the world had shrunk a little, and she was remembering how it once felt to be small. In it, Elias knew the signs. Grief doesn't always show up in tears, he said, one night by the fire. Sometimes it just takes your appetite and won't give it back for a while. Mercy smiled faintly. She was the first thing I ever trusted. She knew, he said. The next spring, she started building something new. A small structure out past the edge of the creek, with a low roof and wide open windows. No one asked what it was until the day a Lakota girl showed up at her door, thin, hollow-eyed, pregnant. Mercy didn't speak, just led her to the creek, helped her wash, wrapped her in a wool blanket, and made tea. A week later, 2 more came. Then another. Word had spread. Miss Boone took in girls who had nowhere else. Girls who had names they didn't want anymore. Girls who needed silence more than sermons. Elias built more beds. The sheriff came once, now older and moving slow. You, running a home. Mercy shook her head. Not a home, just a place. For what? For the kind of peace you don't have to earn. The sheriff tipped his hat and walked away. One summer evening, Elias didn't come in from the trail. Mercy waited until dusk, then went out with a lantern and found him beneath the tree with the eagle's nest, sitting, not fallen. still breathing, but slower. I reckon this is as far as I go, he said, blinking up at the last blue light in the sky. She knelt beside him, tears already sliding without permission. I'm not ready, she whispered. You weren't ready. When they sold you either, he said, voice like gravel. But you still rose. She tried to laugh. It came out cracked. I never thanked you, she said. You didn't have to, he murmured. You stayed. When his breath stopped, she buried him beside the two graves that had once stood alone. She carved the name herself. Elias Boone, he never touched me once. He just gave me back the pieces they tried to take. Years later still, people came up the ridge not just for medicine or shelter, but for stories. They asked about the mountain man, about the girl with the brand. She never told it the same way twice, sometimes. She said he found her like a coin in the mud and never tried to clean her too hard. Sometimes she said he was a tree, tall, silent, always there. Sometimes she just said, $1 changed everything. But kindness kept it that way. And when the fire burned low and the girls asked what became of the brand, she would roll up her sleeve and show them. It doesn't hurt anymore, she'd say. But I still keep it. So no one forgets. Then she'd pull her sleeve back, down, and the room would fall quiet. Not with fear, but with reverence. Because in a world where some men bought girls like livestock, one man gave her back the name no one else had bothered to ask for: mercy.